Thank you, Nahal. Thank you for that very generous and courteous introduction. And thanks to all of you for being here, for showing an interest in this material and this issue, and for listening to me tell you about something that I hope is important to you. As I said earlier, one of the most impressive things to me about this event is shown in this set of logos. The fact that so many groups with different histories, different constituencies, different purposes, are all pulling together in this cause. It's quite a wonderful thing to see a variegated approach to a matter of common interest. And I am deeply appreciative of your support, but I'm also deeply aware of the kind of responsibility I have to all of you in the work that I'm trying to do. And that's what I'm going to tell you a little bit about before. But those of you who were here before heard me getting a little bit wound up, and you ain't heard nothing yet. This is the stuff I really get wound up about, but I'll try to keep it a little bit shorter. What you're seeing here is a Persepolis fortification tablet. And the reason I like to show this one is that it shows three of the streams of information, kinds of information that come together in the Persepolis Fortification Archive. There is a cuneiform text in the Elamite language. There is this seal impression, rolling out of quite a wonderful seal impression. And if you look closely, you see a single word of Aramaic written in ink on the surface of the tablet. What you're seeing here is not a video. This is the self-demonstration of a program, the implementation of polynomial texture mapping imaging, which I will talk about very briefly later on. And the reason I'm showing this is to show you that this is part of what the Persepolis Fortification Archive project is doing to preserve the information that comes together in these tablets, even if access to the tablets is lost. Namely, recording it in a way and with a technology that allows students of cuneiform, students of art history, students of Aramaic epigraphy, each to look at it literally according to his own lights. The viewer can control this light. Could I have the beginning of the PowerPoint, please? And the next one, please. Well, did I say if access to the original tablets is lost? Yes, you all know, I think, what the issue is. Lawsuits that are now before federal court in Chicago are seeking to force the sale of the Persepolis fortification tablets. And win or lose, the results could be catastrophic for the Persepolis fortification archive as a whole, and even more catastrophic for what we still have to learn from it. Now, I'm going to let others introduce you to the legal crisis, but in the few minutes of your attention that I think I can still claim, I'm going to try to touch on what the Persepolis Fortification Archive is, why it matters, and at least some of what we're doing about it. Could I have the next? There we go. This is Persepolis. I'm sure you all recognize it. It's the palace complex of the Achaemenid Persian kings in the very heartland of their continent-sized empire, the empire that was founded by Cyrus the Great after 550 BC and refounded by Darius after 520, the empire that stretched from southern Egypt to Central Asia, from the Indus to Macedonia, and briefly, in fact, to Athens. Persepolis itself was founded shortly before 500 BC by Darius the Great, and destroyed in 330 BC by Alexander, also called the Great. Archaeologists from the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, somewhat less great, began to excavate there in 1931, and in 1933 they discovered clay tablets and fragments in 2 rooms of a gatehouse in the fortification wall at the edge of the Great Stone Terrace. There was originally a fortification wall that went all the way around the Taht and went around the ridge and the crest of the Kui Rahmat behind it, and the tablets were found here. That's why they're called fortification tablets. It's not because they have anything to do with making or maintaining fortifications. It's because they were found here in a little bastion and gateway through the fortification wall. Now, on March 4th, 1933, the same day that Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated for the first time, and about 3 or 4 days before he shut down every bank in the country in order to avoid a complete collapse of the American and possibly world financial system, Boy, we sure learned a lot from that one, didn't we? On March 4th, the director of the excavation at Persepolis sent a telegram to the director of the Oriental Institute, who was then in Egypt, as it happens, wondering where the money to come home was going to come from. And the telegram said, in the wonderful telegraphic style that people used to have before email, hundreds, probably thousands, business tablets, Elamite discovered on terrace. Well, in fact, they weren't just in Elamite. They were in several languages, as I will show you, and there weren't just hundreds, and there weren't just thousands. There were tens of thousands. Let's see if we can get this. Could you advance it? Thanks. There are four main kinds of documents. In the first place, there are pieces with cuneiform text written in the Elamite language, and most of them have the impressions of seals on them. And there are a lot of these. There are perhaps 10 or 20,000 tablets and fragments of tablets. The next. In the second place, there are pieces that have texts in Aramaic script and in Aramaic language, and all of these have seal impressions. You can't see the impressions on these because they're on the edges that aren't exposed. There are not so many of these, somewhere between 700 and 1,000. And the next. Oops, can you go back? And in the third place, there are pieces that have the impressions of seals, sometimes the impressions of several seals, but have no text at all. And there are quite a lot of these. There are perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 of them. And in the fourth place, there are miscellaneous unique pieces. One in Old Persian, in fact, the only known tablet in Old Persian ever found. One in Greek. One probably in Phrygian. One in Akkadian. There are tablets that bear stamps of coins instead of seals, and not just Persian coins, but also Greek coins, so it tells us something about ancient numismatics. But there are also myriads of fragments and flakes and crumbs, some of which can be put back together into useful tablets, and others of which will almost certainly never be put back together unless we have a very large complement of the kind of people who started reassembling the shredded documents from the American embassy in Tehran. There are tens of thousands of pieces, but they are all pieces of one thing. They are records of one administrative organization, an organization that handled the most basic thing in the world, food. Grain and grain products, beer and wine, fruit and animals. Food meant for people on the government payrolls, and that included workers, craftsmen, clerks, travelers, courtiers, sometimes members of the king's own family, and they were all active in the region around Persepolis during a period of less than 20 years around 500 BC. So it's a narrow view, and it's a dense view of a very short time. As archaeological artifacts, they are all pieces of a single trove, just like a coin hoard. It's all pieces of one trove. They were stored together in antiquity, and they were found together in modern times. As documents, they have common contents and purposes. They fit together systematically, just as modern documents do, as pieces of a coherent single information system produced, kept, used, and consulted by agents of a single organization. The next. These tens of thousands of Persepolis fortification tablets and fragments, and their several different kinds of information, form the single Persepolis fortification archive in exactly the same way that thousands of fossil bones of different shapes and different functions fit together meaningfully as pieces of one ancient animal, an animal that, when you fit it together, tells you something about not just the animal, but the environment and the conditions in which it lived and operated. Next. Still, they're about wine and barley, and about rations and stores. They're not about the deeds and characters of kings or armies on the march or the eunuchs and harem intrigues. They're not about the kinds of things that Hellenistic novels and Greek and Roman and European art, for that matter, American films, history, literature, even films, look for in the exotic Persian Empire. So why are these pieces of old dirt, pieces of mud that somebody poked with a stick or a stone a long time ago, trivial records of food and drink that was consumed by people who were themselves consumed by the dirt a long time ago? Why are they important? They're important next. Could you back? Yeah. Because they constitute the largest, the densest, the most complex, the best dated, the best contextualized source of information from inside Persia on the languages of the Achaemenid Empire, on the art of the Achaemenid Empire, on the society, the religion, the history, the institutions of the Achaemenid Empire, and they are important because this is a completely unique source in both senses. There is nothing else like it, and no other source gives us this information. So let me break that down a little bit. In the first place, Achaemenid languages. Well, most of the texts are in Elamite, the indigenous language of Western Iran that was used for written recording for more than 1,000 years before the speakers of Iranian languages arrived there. Some of the texts are in Aramaic. That was a Semitic language used for local recording, but also for interregional communication all the way across the empire from southern Egypt to Central Asia. But these Elamite and Aramaic documents were also written by and for speakers of Persian and other Old Iranian dialects, and as a result of that, they are riddled with the transcriptions of Old Iranian words and names and even syntactic patterns, information that cannot be found in any other source for Old Iranian languages. Our other sources are royal inscriptions, and they do not talk about beer and barley and goats. And our other sources are the Gathas, and they don't talk about this kind of thing either. This is a unique source of information of language buried inside another language, like a Russian doll. It's also an extraordinary source for Achaemenid art. Almost all of the tablets have the impressions of cylinder seals or stamp seals, often several seals, and altogether these impressions represent thousands of distinct objects. We have so far identified and numbered something like 2,200 distinct seals, and there are thousands more to be identified. And they give us wonderful imagery, sometimes repeated often. This procession scene, you get out of little fragmentary impressions like that. But look at this. I love this one. And those of you who have worked with the archaeology of Iron Age Iran might notice this also. You see in the drawing that was done on the basis of maybe a dozen impressions, you get a sort of incomplete version of the pot. But look up here. We get one more impression and it's complete. It's a beautiful example of an Iron Age bridge-spouted carinated pot of a kind that you can find in every collection of Iron Age archaeology from Iran. You go to Lakma and you will see one of these. And now we know what it's for. But in addition to that, we're seeing thousands of different kinds of scenes. Could I have the next, please? And scenes of a kind that you will never see in the monumental art. Darius and Xerxes are not going to put a couple of guys dancing around a chicken up on the walls of a palace. But we get to see this. This is adding a kind of depth to the art that you will never see somewhere else. And what this means, these satyrs and this animal and the stand that it's on, I leave to other people to figure out. My point is that this art form that we call a minor art form is going to show you a much larger range of images and variation in style and attempts by the artist hand and eye, attempts to adapt and experiment much more so than monumental art and its rigid final results, the kind of stuff you'll find on palace walls. And because these seals are applied specifically in order to indicate the concurrence of particular individuals or particular offices in particular transactions and behaviors, these images aren't just a collection of images, it's art that is deeply and specifically embedded in its society and its moment in history. So society, I said, well, not all, all of the consumers of the food in these documents, it's everybody. They range from gangs of nameless workers getting below subsistence rations, through their supervisors, through district superintendents, people running the storehouses, the clerks, the auditors, the people who kind of check up on how this stuff is going on, all the way up through the court elite and the royal family. We have a narrow window. It's the window that you see looking at out of the lunchbox. But it's showing you a transect through almost the entire range of society in and around the court of the Persian kings at the zenith of the empire. There is almost no other source that will tell you about people as low as this and people as high as this. And I use this as an example, this beautiful stamp seal. It's a great big thing, showing two lions attacking a stag. We know who this belongs to. This belongs to a man who in Persian is called Gaubarua. His Greek name would be Gobrias. He is the son-in-law of Darius. He's married to Darius' daughter, and he's the father of a guy that the Greeks knew as Mardonius, the commander-in-chief of Xerxes' army during the invasion of Greece. So we know from Aeschylus and Herodotus a lot about Mardonius, but we're looking at his daddy's wallet here. And you're not going to find that in any other source. Finally, religion. Let me have the next one, please. Not all of the consumers of this food were human. Some of them are gods. Some are religious events. Some are religious practitioners. And in addition to that, some of these seal impressions are showing us pictures of formal religious observance, things that we otherwise know a little bit from verbal descriptions or we don't know at all from verbal descriptions. And in addition to that, they're also showing us, in the way almost all high art does, they're showing us visualizations of the invisible world, of the supernatural world, of how it's conceptualized. Just as Western painting shows us what angels are supposed to look like, these seals are showing us mythological creatures, the combat between order and chaos, the way in which this is visualized and symbolized, the way the important things about your conceptual world can be given a kind of concrete realization. And again, the range of those images is completely unparalleled anywhere. And, as I said, this is unique. Before 1933, there was only one known Achaemenid Elamite administrative document, and just about nothing could be known about it except it was Achaemenid. We knew that from the seal impression. It was Elamite. We knew that because we couldn't understand it. And it was administrative. We knew that because it looked like an administrative text, and that's all. So on March 4th, March 5th, there were 30,000 of them. And there was a lot of work to be done before some order could be made out of it. But since then, we found really only a few other isolated documents of this kind, just as isolated as that one found before 1933 was. And those are valuable evidence that archives of this kind were kept elsewhere. These are the sole surviving traces of much bigger groups of documents, but this is the only one that we've found so far. So those other traces are only meaningful if we're able to compare them with this. This is the only thing we have, and it's the only source for information of this kind. So it's completely unique, and that's exactly what's at risk now. And the next, please. Each one of the Persepolis fortification pieces carries a complex information load with a value of its own. And if I just found this by myself, I'm a tablet nerd, so I just love this. I would love to have this come across my desk, even if there were 20,000 others like it. But I would be beggaring its value if that's all I saw, because each piece has some value, but the real value is in the whole. It's in the fabric of connections among the pieces of information in the pieces. It's like a tension structure that becomes more stable as you tie more pieces in, and the more stable it becomes, the more you can pile on top of it. The more you know, the more you can know. If you know one occurrence of something, it means one thing. If you know 10, it means it's more frequent. If you know 100 occurrences of exactly the same thing, then all of a sudden you find out that it's regular. It's no longer telling you about language, it's telling you about behavior. The actual quality and nature of the information changes because it's able to be tied to other pieces of information. It turns from mere facts into data. As I said, that's what's at risk. There is a lawsuit. The Persepolis Fortification Archive came to the Oriental Institute at Chicago in 1936. It was on loan for analysis, for conservation, for study, and for publication. Now, this was quite an extraordinary gesture. It was the loan of a unique discovery from the premier archaeological site in the country. Making that loan was an act of enormous trust, and it was not a commonplace behavior in that time. Since then, of course, we have other examples of things like that. This was an early example of a fundamental relationship that has become essential to all modern work in cultural heritage material, whether we're talking about research or publication or museum display. And now there's a litigation in the federal courts that puts not only the Persepolis tablets, but the whole future of that relationship at risk. The plaintiffs are victims of terror bombings in Jerusalem and Beirut. They're acting on amendments to U.S. Foreign Sovereign Immunities Law. They sued the Islamic Republic of Iran. They got a default judgment. They got 2 default judgments, and they're now claiming the tablets as a way of satisfying those judgments. Now, the plaintiffs The plaintiffs are men and women whose lives have been shattered by genuinely barbaric, atrocious acts. People whose loss is dreadful, and the way in which the loss happened is even more dreadful to contemplate. And I would never expect them to see the Persepolis Fortification Archive as I do. But for what I value in this archive, the prospects are, as I said, catastrophic. If the plaintiffs win, the tablets will probably be dispersed by the antiquities market, and anyone who tries to offer you assurances that that won't happen is unrealistic. But if the plaintiffs lose, it's quite likely that the Iranian government might demand immediate repatriation of the entire archive on the ground that we can't protect it from this kind of threat, and they would have a point. So this is not a test, this is a real emergency. And the Persepolis Fortification Archive project at the Oriental Institute operates in emergency conditions with two priorities. First, to make useful records of as much of the archive as we possibly can while they're available to us, and second, to distribute the records we're making quickly and continuously and freely. That means really 5 kinds of interrelated things. First, making images of them, and I've been showing you some. Second, making additions and recording analytical information, because you can't really make a decent image without knowing whether it's a good enough image and what it's an image of. Third, doing a kind of triaging and cataloging, deciding what's important to do first and what we'll get to if we have a chance to do it later. Fourth, delivering this information online, and we're using 3 or 4 different websites to do that. And fifth, trying to conserve the objects, to stabilize them, to put them back together, to clean them, to make them ready to be kept wherever they ultimately end up. And I'll explain a little bit about 2 of these tags. Well, images. I've been showing you mostly conventional digital photographs of Persepolis tablets, and we've been making a lot of these. We've got good imagery of about 3,000 tablets so far with 10 or 20 shots apiece, so it's a lot of stuff. But in addition to that, we're doing a collaboration with the West Semitic Research Project at the University of Southern California and with the support of the Mellon Foundation to do a couple of kinds of rather high-end imagery that's rather better than this. One set of images comes from this unprepossessing thing. It's called a better light scanning camera, and as you can see, it's just a modern form of the old-fashioned studio bellows camera that instead of a photo plate has a large format scanner stuck in there. So you pop the tablet under there, you set it upright, and you photograph it in polarized light, in yellow, orange, red filtered light, in infrared filtered light, and this gives especially good results for Aramaic text in ink, written on difficult circumstances, and the results are sometimes dramatic. Can you all see the Aramaic text in there? Well, I can't, but this is actually what it looks like in ordinary daylight. In fact, it's a little better than it looks in ordinary daylight. If you do it under polarized light, you start to see the ink coming out. If you do it under red light, it comes out a lot better, and if you do it under infrared, it's like it was printed. So what we're doing with this imagery is sometimes, at least, getting a record that is better to read, better to work with than the original object itself. The other set of high-end imagery is done with this thing that looks like R2-D2, or perhaps Fat Man from the Manhattan Project. It's called polynomial texture mapping, and it's what I was demonstrating at the very beginning of the talk with the light moving around. It's digital, high-end digital camera, high-resolution digital camera mounted in a dome. There are 32 lights here. You throw the switch on the controller here, and it takes a programmed sequence of 32 images, each written differently, each lit differently, and the software knits them in an application that allows the viewer to do what I was demonstrating at the beginning. It allows the viewer to manipulate the direction, the angle, the intensity of the apparent light source. And I'm going to show you a couple of flat prints from those images. This is, as you can imagine, especially good for things that are incised or impressed. For example, the strokes of an Aramaic pen, the impressions of a cuneiform stylus, or the impression of a seal. So look here, we can see not only the ink, but the actual pen strokes of the Aramaic scribe. And look at the pen. Anybody remember fountain pens, or are you all still typing away with your thumbs, right? It's a split nib pen of the kind that you would have used if you'd been in a one-room schoolhouse years ago. Not all of them are like that. And this is something, by the way, that for Aramaic epigrapher nerds, not cuneiform nerds like me, it's immensely important to be able to trace the order of the strokes that make these characters. And with this imagery, they can do it much, much, much better than they can with any other. Let me have the next, please. And here's another example. This actually has two Aramaic texts in it, one in ink, one incised, and both written over a seal impression. So what we're seeing actually here is a little history of documentation. This text, this incised text, was written while the clay was still soft enough to take this kind of incision. This text, the ink text, was written when the clay was dry enough to hold the ink without blotting. And both of them are over the seal impression. So you're not seeing just one act here, you're seeing three behaviors, right? You're seeing a little passage through time in this frozen artifact, and you can illustrate all of that with this technology. Next, please. We're also trying to distribute all of this stuff, and I'm going to go through this sort of fairly quickly. We're using at least 4 different websites. I'm going to show you a couple of them. We're showing the imagery, but we're also showing it along with editorial and analytical information. And here's a few views of one of these Aramaic tablets from Persepolis displayed on a program called Inscriptifact. This is the online application of the West Semitic Research Project at the University of Southern California. This is a very robust application. It's been up and running since 2001, but it's building on 30 years of prior experience with very high quality imaging. And at the moment, there are about 9,000 images available of more than 350 Persepolis Aramaic tablets and uninscribed tablets, and there's another 500 or 600 almost ready to go up. They're being vetted on the staging server now. They include high-resolution photos from the better light imagery, flat prints from the PTM imagery. You can crop them, you can download them at your choice of resolutions depending on how broad your bands are. And next, the PTM, the Inscriptifact team has recently developed a really elegant standalone viewer. It's the one that I showed you at the beginning that allows you to display and manipulate very high resolution PTM imagery, and they're beta testing now another version of this viewer that's actually going to be delivering the stuff at high resolution online. In addition to that, here is the Oriental Institute's own website. It's called Online Cultural Heritage Resource Environment, abbreviated OCHR. And for those of you in this part of California who like this kind of lingo, it's a native XML database with a cross-platform user interface that is designed in order to make it possible to record, interrogate, and display many different kinds of textual and archaeological information. Text in different languages with different grammars, archaeological information all the way from the level of the site under excavation down to the level of the individual artifact. And that makes it ideal for what I need. It makes it ideal for keeping together the several different kinds of information of the Persepolis Fortification Archive, keep them together the way they were in antiquity in the archive, rather than farming out slices of them to the academic subspecialties that are created by modern American universities, sending the cuneiform tablets to cuneiformists, the Aramaic tablets to Aramaists, the sealed tablets to art historians, and hoping that someday they talk to each other, even though they don't all talk the same language. Now it's going to be possible to put all these together, to separate them as needed, and to interrogate them together. I'm not going to go through a lot of demo of this, but I want to show you that you can do at least a few complicated things. So here's an ochre display of an Elamite document that was actually edited in preliminary form way back in the 1960s, but never published. So what I'm displaying here is a little bit of cataloging information, information on the seals, a modern form of a transliteration, a translation. I click on a word here, it opens up a glossary entry. I click on another glossary entry, it opens up another window with another occurrence of the same text. So instead of having to thumb back and forth between the book and the dictionary and then open the book to 2 different places, I have it all open in front of me in this same window. If I don't like that, if I don't remember what the Elamite words are, I go to this roughly sorted topical glossary. I say, tell me about text with wine. It gives me the entry for wine. I go to the dictionary. I can open up as many of those texts as I want to. And what's more, I can display all of these glossaries include a lot of grammatical and morphological information. Every form is parsed. It's partially done by the computer. We have to do a little bit of checking to correct the computer here and there, But as you start getting more forms in, more of it is automatic, and you can display this with every bit of morphology parsed, and eventually you're going to be able to search that for syntax and connect it with not only the translation, but the imagery. And the next one, and for that matter, we're tagging the photos so that instead of having to go to a sign list and look up representative forms, you're going to be able to do paleography, the real use of the cuneiform signs by individual scribes at the ground level, and say, show me all examples of the sign ki in ma ki ip written in year 22 in these places. So you're going to be able to do low-level patterning and high-level patterning and so on. And you're going to be able to do similar things for the uninscribed tablets. Here's drawing. This is actually a low resolution, screen resolution PTM. This is live online now. So you can manipulate the lighting on this as you want to. And you're going to be able to do it for the Aramaic. This is one of those filtered better light photos. This is a PTM. You can manage the light on it. This is an old drawing done back in the 1940s, actually. So you can see what the difference between the tablet is now and what the guy saw back in the 1940s. I'm not going to go on and on about this because, let me back up. Can you back up a little bit? Go back another. But even without live demos, I hope you'll recognize what I'm driving at, namely that this kind of presentation, not just recording it, but presenting it to a potential scholarly audience, is not only going to preserve what we know about it in terms of current scholarship, but it's presenting it in a format that is going to make it possible to investigate questions that could not have been handled with conventional hard copy book publication. Now, as I work on this stuff, in my aging bonehead nerd way, I managed to stumble across one or two odd and interesting things. But I have to tell you, my fondest hope is that I am making it possible for my successors to manipulate this information in ways that will cause them to laugh at, to jeer at my primitive conception of the possibilities of this data set. And that's what scholarship in science is about. You don't want to build a monument to yourself. You want to make yourself obsolete. And I think this is going to be a big step toward making me obsolete. I just need a couple of semi-sane people to read Elamite first. Well, in the meantime, though, before they start laughing at me and jeering at me and putting me out to pasture, as I hope they will, we have this emergency. The archive faces a persistent threat, and the project faces persistent problems. Now, all of those problems can be solved with, guess what? Time, money, skill, and cooperation. No big surprises there. As to time, that depends on the federal courts right now. As to money, that depends on the fortunes of grant applications, the generosity of supporters, and, for that matter, the future of the Friends of the Persepolis Fortification Archive Project and its goals. As to skill and collaboration, I have the next. We're quite fortunate. We have a team assembled who have an advanced knowledge of the data and its capabilities. It's a team that could never have been assembled before, not 10 years ago, not 5 years ago. And the reason for that is that these are the people who organized the knowledge as we have it now, developed the capabilities, and set the groundwork for going forward with it. So if this team can keep working for another, say, 3 to 5 years, I'm actually mildly optimistic. I think we can record, 10,000 or more of the fortification tablets and fragments, and given a little more time than that, we can distribute good, usable records of them, and we and our successors, let me say, 10 to 12,000 tablets, that's an extraordinarily large sample for this kind of thing, done in an extraordinarily short time. So if we manage to accomplish that, we will have done something that very few other people working on a complex of ancient materials of this kind have managed before. Look at the great papyrological publication projects, the great cuneiform publication projects. They took a generation to do this. It took us a generation to get to the point where we can do it, but now, given time, given access, given support, we can move really pretty quickly on this. And if we do that, we, or our successors, can do something more important. We can vastly enlarge and deepen our view, not just of the archive, but of the historical conditions, the social conditions, the artistic conditions, the linguistic conditions the conditions to which this archive is the unique surviving witness. We know a lot about how the T-Rex lived, in part because we have a lot of T-Rexes to look at. But the only thing that we can see moving around in its ancient world in this way is this archive. And if we can do this work for another 3, 5, 6 years, we'll be able to do a lot to change our understanding of all of those things. And I hope I don't need to persuade anybody who has taken the trouble to come to this event that knowledge of those historical conditions is something of value not only to people for whom Iranian culture is something of personal value, but it's something of value to civilized men and women, that is, men and women who are the inheritors and participants in civilization everywhere in the world. Thank you for your polite attention. Yeah, I can tell you some of what they tell us something about, not so much the status of women. This is always one of the problems I run into in talking to my colleagues who do women's studies, because they're asked to do courses on what in the late Ottoman Empire and the Young Turk period was called the woman question, as if all women were something that you could describe so easily. But what we find in these tablets is a transect through society, as I said, all the way from workers working at below subsistence levels up through members of the royal family. And throughout that transect, we find women. So we're seeing women who are getting rations because they're workers, women who are getting higher rations because they're supervisor of workers. We're seeing one thing that men can't do, that is, we're seeing women, postpartum women, women who have given birth, who are getting special rations after giving birth. And I have to tell you that they get twice as much if they've given birth to a boy than if they've given birth to a girl. But we're also seeing more highly placed women. We see some of the women of Darius's family, whom we know by name from the Greek historians, and we see that they're part of the system. They have an interest in the flow of these goods, and they also have property at which this stuff is stored and through which it moves. So you see a very high-ranking behavior of women of the court of a kind that's quite different from what you see in the Greek historians. It's not like the evil queen Persicetus poisoning one of her rivals. It's the forebear of Persicetus running in an estate and telling her estate manager to hand out thus and so much barley or beer or wine or animals to her subordinates and charge it to her account. So we're seeing in a way that is sometimes invisible, even though it's probably there, not so much the status of women, but the occupation of the presence of women in statuses of many kinds throughout the environment around the court. Pardon me.
What percentage of these tablets are in the States? Are all of them here, or it is only part of that?
Only part of them are here.
And then how can you then interpret the other part that is not here? And the second question is, what was the condition for sending them to the States? Was that for a limited time, or it is supposed to be returned? And finally, hopefully, the court will decide against selling these, and you can keep it. But would the institute return them to Iran after you have completed 5, 6 years, you mentioned, to catalog all these?
Those are all complicated questions, and I've, of course, thought about them and talked about them before. So, as to how many are in Chicago and how many are in Iran, A very large number of fragments are in Iran. We had a receipt at the Oriental Institute that said we sent back 30,000 tablets and fragments. We thought, what's that? That's the estimated number of all of them. This must be a mistake, either that or we were trying to run a scam somehow. But then, about 10 years ago, somebody in the Iran Bastan, somebody in the museum in Tehran found the boxes that had been sent back in 1950 something, early 50s. And had never been opened. So we sent them back and that was it, nobody cared. Well, what's in those boxes is tens of thousands of pieces indeed, but they're almost all fairly small pieces. Very little of that is going to turn into very productive text. You'll get some pretty good seal impressions, and those pieces will only be useful if the stuff that we have in Chicago is used to its maximum, and if technology develops, for example, pattern recognition technology that allow us to plug these things back together, because it's very seldom that we can put pieces from different parts of the archive back together if it's broken in the first place. And that's something that's going to have to improve, and a large part of that is in Tehran. Now, in addition to that, in the early 50s, we sent back about 170 pieces, including about 150 Elamite tablets, and then the others were of the other categories. And those are all in Tehran, and everybody knows where they are, and they've been looked at, and actually recently published by Abdul Majid Arfai. And then in addition to that, in 2003, we sent back another 300 of the ones that had been thoroughly published, and we did good digital images and said, great, now is a good time to start honoring our commitment to return these. And we started to send them back. And that was, we thought, going to be the first installment of a long process in which our return of the tablets was keyed in with our process of analyzing and publishing them. But that was a classic case of no good deed going unpunished, because we got a lot of pretty good publicity for that. And even in difficult political conditions, the University of Chicago is honoring its commitments that were undertaken 60 years ago in returning this material. And that's when we got slapped with a lawsuit. So we haven't returned any since then because the matter is under litigation. The terms of the original loan, I don't know how to answer, because part of what's gone on in the litigation is they say, produce the terms of the original loan, and nobody, not in Chicago nor in Iran, has been able to find the document. We can find statements that it was a loan. I have found things in the University of Chicago magazine from 1936 while the tablets were at sea on their way to Chicago to say, we're getting these on loan and what an extraordinary gesture it is, and we really want to get going on them pretty quickly. But whether there was a time limit or not, I don't know. And what the nature of the understanding was, I don't know, and I don't think we can know anymore. And as to the final question, if the lawsuit is unsuccessful, if these are not sold, will we continue to return them to Iran? I say yes. I mean, it is absolutely essential to the future of research by a university like ours that when we undertake a commitment like this, we honor a commitment like this. And it is also absolutely essential, I think, that the university not be seen as a collector. We don't want these objects for objects. We want these objects for research. And what we're doing with them is trying to get knowledge out of them, to try to do what universities do, and that is to create new knowledge. Once we have done that, being able to put them on exhibit is very useful in that it teaches other people, but it's just as useful to put them on exhibit in Iran and for us to display them online in this way. So my idea of why I want to be able to publish it in this way and why I want it to be going out over the web now is that if we get a favorable outcome to the lawsuit, I want to be able to say to people in Iran who say, give them back and give them all back right away, I want to say, we've got a going concern. We are working through this material. We are producing knowledge. We are making something out of this. And whatever happens to the future of this, win or lose, I would hope that we can negotiate some schedule that will allow us to turn the stuff over, whether to Iran or, heaven help us, to somebody else, in a way that allows us to do at least to complete research according to contemporary standards. Even that is losing a little bit of ground, because if the tablets become inaccessible to future research, people years from now are going to be able to see more in them than we can. We're going to look like primitives in 10 or 20 years. It took from 1936 to 1969 to publish the first bunch of these texts. And then it took a little while after that for people to understand what the real significance was. But beginning in the middle 1970s, the availability of this material completely transformed every kind of study of the Achaemenid Empire. Historical study, political study, institutional, artistic, linguistic. You can still read books about Achaemenid history that ignore this, but they're wrong. They're blind. They're deliberately ignoring a crucial source. What's gone on since the middle 1970s is a complete revitalization of the Achaemenid Empire as a significant research topic in many, many other fields, including fields that thought, oh, this doesn't belong to the ancient Near East, it just belongs to Greek history somewhere. So that they've had a colossal impact. Some of that impact is very, very good scholarship. Some of it is, like all scholarship, a little nutty. But nevertheless, that's the marketplace of ideas, and eventually, we hope, the less nutty prevails over the more nutty, the less nutty prevails over the more nutty, and gradually we get new ideas. It's like any other science. You know, what you know changes. You know more as you go along. But the fact is that the basic publication of the texts has led to many, many, many books and articles, and has also led to a kind of cooperation among scholars that wasn't there before. This has catalyzed all kinds of things even before this came up. So in the world of people who work on Achaemenid studies, they know this stuff, and they know the impact it's had.
Dr. Stolper, in the interest of time, we'll just allow one other question, and hopefully everybody else will get a chance to speak to you at
Thank you for excellent presentation. My question is purely technical on the legality of it. There was a discussion here on some media that if the University of Chicago has benefited and has made some revenues from these artifacts here in the United States, then this could be challenged in the court by the people that have brought the lawsuit. Maybe the next speaker can talk about it as well, but I would like to hear from you.
Well, I have to preface anything I say about that by telling you that our lawyers tell me not to talk about the law because I don't know the law and I'll get it wrong and I'll make it worse. And I will also say that later on during the roundtable we're going to be discussing, I think, the legal issues, and I will hope to hold my tongue, although, as you may have noticed, it's not an easy thing for me to do.
And now really just one final last question.
But
Thank you. We briefly discussed this over the break, but I think it's important for the audience to know how much Iranian Americans are actually, following up with your studies and looking into these artifacts and actually, receiving this, and who is the counterpart in Iran that is receiving these as they go back? Because there's Iran, and then there should be a research team of some sort that would be receiving these archives, because I'm kind of in the dark as to, I think the last 30 years we haven't really had any interest in these types of research. So, if you can clarify, that'd be great.
I'm not sure that I can clarify it, because like most Americans, what really happens in Iran is rather mysterious to me. American journalistic sources are not very good sources, and I don't have sources inside Iran, and you all may be able to clarify this to me better than I can. My impression of what goes on in Iran, whether at the political level or the cultural political level, is that there is a great deal of disagreement about policy and control and power. So if these go back to Iran, they go back to the National Museum of Iran, and then it's kind of up to the administration of the National Museum what happens to them after that. Until a few years ago, there was a great deal of difference of opinion among people working in the museum, although the administration of the museum and of the Cultural Heritage Organization, now the Cultural Heritage and Tourism Organization, they were kind of quite favorable to this. And they were at least willing to put them on display and quite interested in it. What the condition there is right now, I'm not so sure. Now, there are a few young Iranian scholars studying, not in the United States, but in European universities, getting some of the background, especially in cuneiform studies, that would be valuable for pursuing studies on this. But at the moment, a research team in Iran, there are very few people who did develop some competence in it, and I'm afraid they don't get along with each other very well. So research and team turn out not to go together so well under current conditions in Iran. But that could change. That could change. It's precisely if you are able to have a kind of negotiated and scheduled settlement that you will be able to build up studies not only here but there. It's going to be a painful process. This is a field that goes through a lot of childhood diseases and seems to have to repeat them again and again. But nevertheless, I am deeply cynical about my fellow man, but deeply optimistic about the future of rational knowledge, so that if we can make data available for rational knowledge, I expect somewhere down the line good outcomes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stolper. Fascinating presentation. Sorry we have to bring it to an end.